We had a little delay this morning on account of the videotape, but I understand it's solved. We have a very interesting problem today. Sir Wallace Budge of the British Museum's Department of Egyptology and Babylonia pointed out that probably the most ancient civilization recorded on the western side of evolution was in the valley of the Euphrates. Babylonia and Phoenicia and Saba, from which we have later created the word Sheba. These civilizations were scientifically established not less than 5000 BC. Many believe much longer. And it was from this area that sciences in the Western world had their beginnings. On the plains of Babylonia, there were great observatories that were in ruins long before the beginning of Greek civilization. These towers were observatories, and they were also mysterious analogical symbols of beliefs that were held at that time. According to the Babylonians, the universe was a kind of mountain, and this mountain rose in 7 ridges, or in 7 levels, and finally at the top was an altar for the eternal God. Each of the levels of the towers, called ziggurats, was of a different color, and various pigments were used in the making of brick or of painting the surfaces afterwards. These colors represented those assigned to the 7 planets known to the ancients. More correctly, 5 planets and 2 luminaries. These planet-luminary combinations represented a ladder, its lower rung upon the surface of the earth, and its higher rung reaching up to the jewel of 7 stars, the mystery of the Dipper. Actually, life to these people was a series of systematic ascents, and this system of ascending values applied to everything. It applied to the life of plants and flowers. It applied to the life of mankind, to nations, and to the planet itself. Every form of life was advancing systematically through 7 steps, and these steps had to be fulfilled if the final purpose of evolution was to be attained. These beliefs were very strongly transferred to Egypt and later to Greece and Rome. And the wise men of Babylonia came to be called Chaldeans, a term that did not necessarily mean that they came from the area known as Chaldea, which was part of Babylonia, but because of their knowledge, their wisdom. The Chaldeans were the sages that governed the states, regulated the empires, and informed and instructed the rulers. All of this was part of a very interesting program, a program which had to do with the 7 steps that all living things must make between their entry into this world and their departure therefrom. And regardless of the passing of time, of ages, of civilizations, and the rise and fall of customs and governments, these 7 steps came into prominence and were assigned to every living thing. All things that entered this world with the first step left with the 7th. And between the 2 were all the others in their proper sequences. Now, each of these steps was not only a symbolic pattern, but it was a responsibility. These 7 steps constituted the way in which all living things mature according to natural law. And any break or variation in this pattern was disastrous to those who broke the law. These 7 steps were the things that human beings and nations likewise had to understand and had to abide by the rules of the 7 stars, as they were called in those days. Now, this has nothing to do with astrology, so called. It has to do with a symbolic picture of the world as it was recorded by Ptolemy of Alexandria. And this system of Ptolemy remained undisputed until the rise of Copernicus and Galileo. And according to the Rosicrucians of the 17th century, modern astronomy does not conflict with the ancient system, because they apply to 2 different purposes. And the ancient system is just as true as the modern system, because it relates to psychological and mystical practices and policies which physical astronomy knows nothing about. So with our study of the problem, we come to the conclusion that there was a ladder of 7 problems, 7 things that had to be accomplished, 7 patterns of laws that had to be kept, 7 departments of human conduct that had to be fulfilled if the being was to pass on to the higher realms of insight. So we have this little problem this morning, and in the days of Ptolemy, the 7 luminary planets, or the combination of 5 planets and 2 luminaries, were assigned as rulers of these 7 steps. And these rulerships had nothing to do with fortune-telling, and had nothing to do at all with the idea of the planets in their rulerships over personal destiny. The planets became the symbols of the great problems that had to be faced. And in mysterious ways, these planets were not only designating the fates of persons, they were also showing the pattern by which everything must live if it is to survive. Nature's laws were embodied in this septenary, and no one could break the rules without suffering. We are beginning now, in the last 5 years perhaps especially, to be aware of the danger of breaking rules. For some time we have lived very badly. For a long time we have abused nature. We have continued to break the normal patterns of human life, and in so doing have brought down upon ourselves one calamity after another. It is not that these calamities arise out of some mysterious evil spirit in the sky. They arise from the natural breaking of natural law. They arise from the fact that the individual does not keep the rules by which the universe was created, by which it must be maintained, and by which it will ultimately achieve perfection and pass on to still higher levels of life and patterned purpose. So in this particular case, we know that the planets represented problems. This doesn't mean that the planets bestowed these problems. They merely became symbols of them. The problems themselves are part of a great septenary of immutable principles and processes going on in life. The ancients understood this by a series of astronomical allegories, symbols, creating what is known as the geocentric system, a universe with the earth in the center and not the sun. Now, the reason why the earth is in the center of this pattern is because this is where we are. And this pattern is prepared for us. It isn't prepared for creatures living on the sun or in the galaxy. It is prepared for individuals who come into this world, into this earth, into this natural environment. And they are the ones that have to obey these rules. And for these people, in this pattern, the ascending order of the planets and luminaries was different from that of today. It is not parallel with our modern concept of the solar system. In those ancient times, the planets ascending from the surface of the earth began with the moon. The moon was the first. The second was Mercury. The third was Venus. The fourth was the sun. The fifth was Mars. The sixth was Jupiter. And the seventh was Saturn. And those were the septenaries. Those were the great deities of the Olympian throne. and also show in Oriental philosophy. Now these 7 constituted the ladder about up which the human being, the nation, the world, governments, religions, everything have to ascend in the process of birth and rebirth. Birth into this world and rebirth into the natural universe toward which we are all moving. In the old days, the Sabians and Chaldeans and Babylonian seers, and it's interesting that in the latest revision of the Bible, the 3 wise men who came to the cradle of Jesus are restored to their original meaning. The printed version now says the 3 astronomers, or astrologers. They were the Babylonians coming in search of the fulfillment of a natural law. So with this point in view, we are reminded that in the ancient times, the different ones of these 7 orbits, or 7 forces, were given different year allotments. Some had many years given to them and some a few. But with the addition of 3 planets to the solar system in more recent times, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, we now have 10 instead of 7 elements with which to work. To meet this command or change, it has been normally accepted to allow each of the 10 to represent 10 years of natural life. Therefore, the 10 planets, or the 8 planets and the 2 luminaries, cover a period of life of 100 years, each one having 10 years, each one assigned to a 10-year period. And through these sets of 10-year periods, all living things pass. Kingdoms pass into democracies and into chaos. Governments go from strictness to anarchy. Human beings pass from childhood to old age. Health passes from good to bad. Virtues rise and fall. Empires come and go. Wars and peace alternate. In all things, this septenary, or now brought up to a decade of 10, represent 10 periods of 10 years each. And therefore, what we're going to do now is to determine, if we can, the rules of these 10-year periods as they relate to the civilization we live in now, not as the ancient times, and also relate to the 10 inevitable divisions of human life. We not only have what the ancients referred to as the 7 rounds and races, that was part of it in the old days, but now we have the 10 instead of 7. And we have to recognize the need of coming to a new pattern of interpretation. To begin with, then, we will take the first, which was symbolized on the ziggurats of Babylon by a white platform, the lowest of the various platforms of the pyramids or towers of observation. So this is governed by the moon. So for the first 10 years of natural life, or the first 10th of world life, the ruler was the moon. Now the moon represented a series of processes that had to be followed. The moon was the symbol of water from which life comes. The moon was the symbol of the eternal mother, the great lunar goddess, Isis, the lady of the moon. It was also the same in the old rites and ceremonies, that this was the beginning of life. Now what is bestowed by this is a very interesting pattern, and the ancients summed it very simply. The whole existence of a race or a nation depends upon the first 10th of its duration. If it is a human being, 10 years. In a nation it may be 100 years, to be 1/10 of its age. But for human beings, this process extends from the first to the 10th year of life. And back in Babylonia in the old days, said if this first 10th went wrong, all the rest would go wrong. In the first 10 years, the child coming into embodiment must have certain processes fulfilled to perpetuate it. It must have all the needs that must be developed. And the Babylonians way back in their days pointed out definitely that the first thing to help a child coming into life must be that it is wanted. It must be brought in from the need of the parent to fulfill the law of life. It must be no accident, no incident, nothing that is a problem or a worry. For if there's a worry in the heart of the mother, there will be a defect in the mind of the child. All of this early part must be right. The child must learn, first of all, to know that it is loved and cared for. It must be taught to walk. It must be taught to use its faculties. It must be taught what to eat and how to eat. It must be given all the care, love, and attention necessary to a little stranger that has come into an unknown world, a world which it has nothing to protect it but the parents. Therefore, the moment the child is conceived, a great duty falls upon the adults. And if those duties and that duty, if this is not fulfilled, the child and the parents will both suffer. This was a rule back in the days of Hammurabi, king of Babylonia, that all these processes must be sincere, meaningful, and purposeful. Now, as we go on into the child in the period of its lunar life, we also find all of the stages of unfolding consciousness, its contact with the outside world, its more intimate contact with parents, and later with friends and brothers and sisters. All these things must be fulfilled with absolute sincerity. They must be real, they must be true, and they must be important. If these are neglected, we begin to produce a generation of misfits, and that is exactly where we are today. The Babylonians were just assured it 6,000-7,000 years ago. After it gets a little older, then comes the problem of introducing this little one to a world in which there are still other steps to follow. All of the essentials of life were brought into manifestation and brought into purposeful existence in this period of the moon's ruling the infant. We find, for instance, that Comenius, the founder of the public school system, writing in the 17th century A.D., said definitely that all civilization begins with the relationship between the child and parents. Nothing else can substitute. You cannot buy a tutor for $1,000 an hour that can take the place of the natural affection of parents. Also, the parent must be a natural, honest, honorable teacher. Whatever the parent advises the child to do, it must do itself also. It must keep the rules that he gives to the child, or the child will fail. Comenius, the founder of the modern public school system, brought this out very well, and it was reaffirmed in the labors of Madame Montessori. Namely, that the first school, the first place of learning, is at the mother's knee. It is before the child enters kindergarten that its morality for life is established. This establishment may be considered as psychic. It is a communication outside of words and terms. It is something that happens. It is an almost magnetic exchange of values. But it all has to be done while the moon is guiding the infant into the next step of its development. Here we find the beginnings of religion. Religion begins in the home. The religion begins when the parents practice the commandments and also bestow from their own consciousness the beauties of the Beatitudes. Here the child has to learn to see the world for the first time. It learns the beginnings of its language, of its relationships, of its duties, of its responsibilities. And it also becomes aware of the strength of the world into which it is coming. And if this world into which it comes is not strong, the child is weakened. So in this period, all the foundations are put in. Before the child is 10 years old, finishing the lunar cycle, its character is established, its probabilities of happiness, of success, of its interest in making a contribution to life, its morality, its ethics, all these things have to be there in seed form before the second layer comes in. The years between 11 and 20 were ruled by Mercury, and Mercury was associated by the ancients with education. Here the child comes for the first time into contact with learning as such. And what is learning? What is education? Education is teaching the child how to use the experiences of the past to make the present better for all concerned. Any method of education which distorts the history, deforms or discharges the moral responsibilities established by nature, can be injurious to the child. It has to learn its 3 R's. It must also add another one to all the others, and that is, it must learn faith, love. It must see that education helps the individual to be better, not just simply brighter. That education is a moral, spiritual, intellectual, physical system of improving character. Any education which does not make the person a better person is no substitute for knowledge. It's an education which teaches him to keep a job or advance in business, but does not teach him to keep the rules of basic living. Thus an education is false. So education becomes the great problem of the second period. This is the first impact of the world upon the child. The child then learns how other people live, how other people think. And if the child's personal life has not been integrated before it is ushered into this vast cyclone, its future is exceedingly doubtful. And the mistakes made in these periods cannot be rectified later. That is, not entirely. They can be helped. But those basic convictions upon which we all must learn to live and lean, always must be established first. So the end of education is to produce a good human being, intelligent in realities, able to face life with truth, able to meet the emergencies of life with understanding, with courage, and with integrity. If education does not make a better person, a skillful one can ruin the world. So we have to be very watchful and thoughtful of how we use these problems as they come along. Here's the second problem then, learning. And unless this problem is solved, we're all in trouble. And it has not been solved. There were moments when it was better than it is now. There were moments when it was worse. But the fact remains that the average individual can go from the cradle to the grave and consider themselves a success in many fields and in many areas, without for one moment believing that it is necessary to cultivate personal virtues. Out to make a name for himself, out for success, all education being turned towards adjustment to a material world rather than the unfoldment of an internal potential. And yet even the educator must know that all this education and all that comes from it, all the physical part of it, is temporal. The individual will last a few years and depart. And all the things that he could take with him he has left undeveloped. And all that he must leave behind has been made important. So this is the second. To make an education that not only will go through this life but beyond, will help to make the individual a reasonable and proper member of the universal family. The same thing is true in community life. The educational system of nations. A nation which does not have an idealistic concept of education will always be in trouble. Because within the individual, when we break the natural rules of the patterns of life in which he is living, there is something in himself that objects. There is something in himself that tells him that it is wrong. But with many doing the same thing, he gradually ignores his own conscience. But after a while, a conscience comes through, And when this happens in nations, there are revolutions. When it happens with individuals, there can be reformations. But in every case, the beginning of learning, the fulfillment of education, is the production of a better person, not a smarter person. We must have more people who keep the rules because they understand them, rather than try to enforce them with police forces. We have to have police on the outside because the individual will not police himself. But a person who cannot police himself cannot be considered educated, even if he speaks 20 languages. There's not much more to it. Presuming, however, that he survives this period, that his education now is brought him to the threshold of maturity, then comes the third step, from the years 21 to 30. And these years are under the leadership of Venus. Now in this period, it is assumed that the normal human being establishes a home. This is the beginning of a communal existence. This is the beginning of a democracy in nations and a sharing in personal relationships. Here the virtue of unselfishness is strongly emphasized, and the mere fact that it is not practiced has no effect except to prevent it from being a successful union of persons. Only when the individuals involved in building homes really believe in homes, are really ready to sacrifice something of themselves for the perpetuation of the institutions they have established, only when this happens can we have a true home. And a home that breaks up is a disaster. We have now come to the point where trying to keep it together seems more of a disaster. But this is because of the way in which we have misused the various processes of life. The home, the family, and the experiences of parenthood are of the greatest importance in maturing the inner life of the individual as it climbs the steps of the ladder of the 7 stars. Here he becomes, and she becomes, the actual participant in the first universal mystery. Here individuals repeat in a small way the opening chapters of Genesis. Here the individual suddenly becomes a responsible member, responsible to carry on and perpetuate the society to which he belongs. He not only has to live within the rules of right conduct, but he must produce progeny that are educated in right conduct. He must pass on to the next generation the torch of proper living. So here we have the beginning then of the personal sacrifices, the individual giving up the luxuries for the necessities, the individual giving up a great deal of individual independence to create the interdependence necessary for a home. Here then relationships are refined. Relationships are brought into a more noble aspect with each other. And where this fails, where these have become merely incidents, where the career still dominates and family is incidental, we have another generation of potential criminals and potential narcotic addicts. Unless these rules are kept, the world will not and cannot hold together. And these rules are not unreasonable. They are the rules that would be naturally present if the individual had not created an artificial world and then spends his time trying to maintain it. Everything in nature works properly. And among the various kingdoms of nature, those that have proper insights, which most animals, birds, and even plants have this, will get along nicely. It is only when human ignorance, interference, and stubbornness upsets the balance of nature that all the other forms of life seem to be in disorder. So we have the establishment of the foundations of the future. It is between the years of 21 and 30 that a nation, that is in its cycle of time, that a nation ensures tomorrow. Without the future, we cannot hope to have a world that goes on. and there can be no future unless between the years of 21 and 30, men and women unite to protect the unborn generations to come. To neglect this is to end in constant war, revolution, anarchy, terrorism, and the like. Assuming, therefore, that the family is now understanding these things and is taking a proper attitude toward them, we pass to the next step. And this is the step from 31 to 40, and is under the rulership of the Son. The keynote for this particular level is career. Here the individual must establish himself in the society of which he is a part. This does not mean that he has to conform with things as they are, but he must determine the degree of his own personal life, or the life with which he is most influential. He must realize the necessity of becoming a self-supporting, family-supporting person. The individual, male or female, who comes to this period in life must begin to feel the weight of responsibility for the future and begin the process of gradually giving up a great many foolish and unnecessary activities to perpetuate that which is important. One of the keys of this is to remember that the Son gives life to everything, and also then becomes a symbol of providence. It provides, and it is the part of the person between these years to provide the necessities of life, to take care of duties, obligations, and proper usefulness to life, that the individual begins to realize that he must sacrifice something of his own pleasures in order to perpetuate the society to which he belongs. If he continues to go on as a wastrel, thinking of nothing but himself, with no ideals, no integrities, no sense of values, living only for fun or extravagance, or else living upon the bounty of the labors of others, this individual is not only a failure himself, but contributes to the grand failure of cultures built upon such a foundation. He cannot work this way and succeed himself or protect the world, but it is this discontent that arises from failure to make proper use of potential. Everyone must try, to the best of their abilities, to bring into the world children who, when they reach this age, will be aware of the proper place of mature person in the society to which he belongs. It is his purpose to be productive. It is his purpose to be self-supporting. It is his purpose to say faithfully and truly that his word is his bond. If he sells, his materials must be right. Whatever he engages in must be honestly done. And whatever he attempts to do should be with full justice to himself and to others involved in the transaction. So out of this material period of adjustment comes also honesty and the light of truth gradually dawning within the person. Gradually the individual realizes that as a person he is limited and he is temporary. But there is a possibility that in those few years he may change the history of his world. So with all due respect for his rights and privileges, it is his duty in this period under the Son's rulership to be self-supporting, independent, and to live on an integrity above money. He is entitled to what he needs. He is entitled to earn what he can. But if he wishes to be a greater earner, he must make greater contributions to the lasting good of society. Wealth that does not result from labor for the common good will produce more crime. Every abuse is a source of tragedy, and every bit of selfishness is some form of abuse, so that these things have to be taken and understood and worked with as best we can. So we'll assume now that the individual has reached that period in life when he is established in his business or established in his career, he is supporting his family, he is not wasting, he is not deceiving, he is not exploiting. He is doing what he should be doing and he is responsible, and he accepts this responsibility as a privilege and not as a nasty obligation. So from there he passes to the next 10 years in which he is under the rulership, or the years themselves are under the rulership of Mars. Now Mars is a very difficult planet to understand. We have a tendency to assign to it the problems of war. This is not true, however. Mars is the first level which has to do with the recognition or realization of what we may call retrospection. It is during the period of Mars that the individual begins to sense the values of his own background, of the life he has been through. It is a time of self-censure, self-discipline, and self-control. If it is necessary in this period, the individual should punish himself for his own mistakes, and should blame himself for the tragedies he has brought into the lives of others, and place a strong and positive and powerful discipline upon his own nature. It is only in this way that he can make up for the fact that he has overlooked and ignored much of his own past. He has to face what he has been and what he has done. And this is not always easy. It has a tendency to demand a reflection, and he begins to say to himself, what have I done? And if he analyzes it carefully enough, he may be terribly disappointed in his own character and in his own life, because he can only count as assets those things by which his actions have assisted others. Actions which are for himself alone are not allowable on this level. If that is not understood, the level itself becomes a very painful experience. So from 1 to 10, adjustment to the world. From 10 to 20, education. From 20 to 30, establishment of family. From 30 to 40, establishment of career. From 40 to 50, Mars. Mars now begins to assert itself because the individual has less likelihood of starting new ventures or of breaking through the patterns. What begins at this time is retributional reactions. From 40 to 50, the first aches and pains may begin. The first disappointments may show up. There is danger of the broken home. There is danger of the rebellious child. There is danger also of the slowing down of bodily functions because of excesses. So the person at that time has to have the lesser climacteric. And if this does not count, then he goes on a little longer. But a great number of dissipated people who are perverse and have neglected to take care of their own integrities, enter into the period of the smaller climacteric, which occurs in the 40s. And it's been very many people who have lived too recklessly find this a period of extreme danger, and the beginning of the realization that man lives not by his body or for his body alone, because his body is beginning to show a little wear and tear. And this he must face, not just simply accept the fact that he is getting older, but accept the fact that he is forced by nature to accept the purpose for his own existence, which he may have denied entirely up to that period in his life. He would not want to acknowledge that he had anything more important than what he was wanting to do. He may then begin to relent a little bit from some of his pressures, and he may also begin to realize that he has wasted too many hours on television or on other things of this nature. He has not realized that time wasted is time lost. He doesn't realize that he has an allotment and is using it more rapidly than he should. He has now come to a point where he might be a wiser person, but he hasn't prepared for it. So that as he loses his grip upon certain material situations, his life becomes less and less important to him because he has built nothing else. So this begins to be a source of conflict, a source of repentance in some cases, a source of conversion in others. The individual, for the first time, becomes aware of the fact that he was the captain of his own destiny and is on his way to wreck the ship. This type of realization becomes rather useful and becomes important at this stage in life. Now, as he goes on, he comes under the rulership of the planet Jupiter for the next 10 years. Now, Jupiter has several values. Jupiter suggests the height of his career. It suggests that he now comes face to face with the fact that he has, what we may say, made his little pile and is going to sit on it the rest of his life. But when he decides to do this, he may find that he's not doing as well as he expected. He is now being faced with a new challenge of sharing, a new challenge of meaningfulness. He has probably most that he will have during this period. Is he doing the most with it? Is he wasting that which he has earned at such high cost to himself? Has he become so involved in the accumulation of wealth that he does not know what to do with his own inner life? Has he sacrificed the inside for the outside, and now suddenly discovers that the old outside is beginning to show signs of wear and tear? The person very often has very doubtful thoughts about this matter. The possibilities of continuing a gay and happy and carefree and worthless life, the possibilities of continuing are growing dimmer. He realizes that there are things he has to do, and he'd better start doing them if he intends to. The worst thing he can do is leave a great fortune to his children, and thus ruin them. Because while making the fortune, he neglected them as people. He turned them to servants. He gave them a wonderful education, sent them to Europe, never let them do a day's honest work, and when the time comes to turn a fortune over to them, they will waste it, or do worse. They will find that these problems come slowly in under Jupiter, which is a thoughtful, philosophical level of contemplation. It is a period in which the person suddenly becomes aware of religious values, becomes involved in the repentances for previous mistakes, and also finds memory of burden upon his soul. All these things he has to work out during that period of 10 years. In that he has to put himself in order. Also, in this particular period, he may come to retirement. He may come to the time when he is no longer going to be part of the rat race, where he is going to settle back and enjoy life. But as he has never done anything enjoyable up to now, what is he going to enjoy from here on out? Not much of anything. He thinks he will travel. After the first trip, he's bored. He thinks he will take up a study. After the first page, he will realize his memory is tired. Little by little, he will sink into a kind of exhaustion in which nothing is important except comfort. And Jupiter is very comfort-loving. But being comfort-loving is very often worthless so far as contributing to the good of anything. He may become very generous and good grandfatherly type of person, but his own inner life may not have been brought one closer to attainment than it was when he was 5 years old. It's always the problem of what we bring forward to the new period that determines whether we have something ahead worth working for himself or something during this period, because he simply can't stand the boredom of doing nothing. What he is really suffering from usually is the boredom of being nothing, of having no internal integrities, inspirations, dedications, or ideals. Sometimes the older person will go into education or something of this nature and may, in some ways, compensate for earlier wasted years. But in the most part, the individual who has gone through the first 60 years of life without any realization of the real meaning of life is not going to do very well thereafter. He is tired, worried, disillusioned, disappointed, has 2 or 3 broken homes behind him, and children that have gone off to live their own lives and depend on him only for a little cash now and then. This is not a fulfillment. So this ladder that we are trying to climb is filled with these decisions, a series of decisions on major levels of personal life. Not decisions all made at once, but decisions that must be made when the environment and the personality itself are in challenge, and which have to be reconciled in one way or another. And then comes the last of the seven according to the ancients, and that is Saturn, which is supposed to rule from the reign of Jupiter to the end of life. Saturn is not necessarily just an end symbol. Saturn is a very interesting situation. Saturn is the dignity of age. Now, age is an experience that every individual has to pass through if they live that long. And age can be to most a disappointment. It can be the loss of the power to continue habits that have become traditionally important. Age is a way which blocks our doing the things in our older years that we enjoyed in our teens and 20s. And as we may never learn to enjoy anything else, age becomes a very barren experience. The individual in his older years is very largely dependent upon the doings of his younger years. He is dependent upon good memories, close friends, children, grandchildren. He is depending largely upon his virtues and his abilities to enjoy the experiences of his own life. He may go into art or music. He may start a little business or a hobby shop of his own. But for the most part, in this period of life, he is depending very largely for happiness upon what he has in his mental and emotional savings account. He is depending on memories that enrich and not memories that impoverish. He is dependent upon releases of consciousness within his own nature. He is becoming dependent upon philosophy, upon art, upon music and ethics. And if he has no enjoyment of these things, then about all he can do is sit in front of a television system and watch the sport programs, so that he can behold a number of young people mauling each other in one way or another. Now, to come through 60 or 70 years of life with nothing more important than to waste time watching commercials on TV is sort of a disappointment to all, including God. It's one of those things that is a story of a wasted life in a wasteful world. It is something that does not work out well, but it will continue this way and not work out well unless the individual starts at an earlier time to make it work out better. He has to recognize that these steps on the ziggurats, the stairs leading up these towers of contemplation, are things that he has to ascend one by one and do something about them. He lives in a magnificent world which is being destroyed by his own stupidity. He is surrounded by opportunities to think and to dream and to hope, and he just sits around doing the things he always has done: read the evening paper, scan the Wall Street Journal, and report on the present crisis in the money markets. Yet in a very short time he won't be here. He may not live to see what happens in the stock exchange, and even if he does, it won't mean much. And the daily reading of it won't help him in a bit. But he hasn't done the things that are necessary. Every person who reaches near the 70th year should be a person with a tremendous desire to use the future for the good of all concerned, including himself. A desire to enrich life, to be able to say that when the curtain goes down, something has been done, something to make the individual proud of himself in a correct way, a gentle sense of fulfillment, that he has contributed to the good of others, has contributed to the good of his world, that he has been able to so improve his own nature that he can pass out of this world a better person than he was when he came in. Very often now it seems that he is worse at the end than when he came in. Because when he came in, he was a beautiful little kid, wonderful, with great big eyes,
everybody loved him, and he was a joy to behold. But somewhere in the world of life, he got over this. And I have known a few, however, who didn't get over it. It can happen, and also without being in his second childhood. It is perfectly possible for an older person to be the most beloved member of a family, or the most useful citizen in the community, or the patron of everything that is good and fine in life. It is perfectly possible for the older person to be busier than he ever was in life before, doing things that he never had time to do before. If he had heavy responsibilities and had a family to take care of, he can excuse himself for lack of nobler incentives. But when these things have been finished, and he stands free to do as he pleases, it is important that he displeases to do something that is worthwhile, so that his life comes to a noble climax rather than a dismal disintegration of faculties. There is no reason why a great many people should come into second childhood at all. The reason is they have never disciplined, never cultured, and never determinedly unfolded their own resources. The mind has not gotten tired and now failed because it was worn out. It has been left to gradually deteriorate and fail from lack of use. The lack of the use of faculties for the purposes for which they were intended is one way to determine the disintegration of memory, imagination, and all of the fine art instincts in the person. Now, according to this, and what has often been called the 7 ages of man, according to Shakespeare, we have the story of a life leading from the cradle to the grave. Now, if this was all there was to it, the life would be pretty much of a mess anyway. If the highest thing that the individual could hope to do is to die rich, the whole purpose of human existence is lost. If the individual also can say fairly that if when he's gone he'll never be missed, that's just as bad. There is no reason why these dismal circumstances should be associated with the development of human beings. The individual should be active to the end of life, and if he is, he will be free from those somatic ailments which very often turn into chronic physical ailments simply because they represent uncorrected attitudes in the mind to begin with. The individual who is busy, conscious, doing the things that are necessary, will have a mind that will serve him as long as he needs it. But if he is also in a mood where he has not done anything to protect or perfect himself, he is likely to be rather a lonely character. Now, if by some chance also, as is quite possible, the older years are handicapped in many ways, or in some special way, there is still in the mature person an inner life which is not dependent upon modern external circumstances. An individual who is no longer capable of activities of any importance, if they have had the activities, if they've done the things, will have a very wonderful series of constructive memories which cannot be taken away from them. They will have the satisfaction of knowing what has been accomplished. They will also have the mastery over the unfortunate reflexes of their own natures, and will have peace of heart and peace of soul. The theory behind it in the ancient world was, live well and die with a good hope. And this is the mystery of the ladder with its 7 rungs. Now, according to modern times, something has been added to this picture. We now have the addition of 3 planets that were unknown to the ancients, or if they were known, were at least not listed exoterically for the benefit of the public. One of these, the first to be discovered, was Uranus. Uranus, which was first named after the King of England and then finally became the name for one of the ancient gods. Uranus, and then came Neptune, and then finally came Lord Pluto, now generally just called Pluto. These 3 are all, we might say, mystery planets. But they take the 70 years, which was based upon the idea of the 70 elders, and also all of the stories of the apostles of Christ, and so on. The 70 was the group number for those who planned the edition of the King James Bible. The 70 years has now been stretched to 100 years. And the 72 years, which originally was regarded as the maximum expectancy of life, is no longer the maximum expectancy. So beyond Saturn, with its aging factor, and with its gradual moving away from the material concerns of life, there are now 3 other steps that have come in. And, incidentally, those attaining 90s or becoming centenarians are no longer completely unusual. The life expectancy is greater than ever before in history. In spite of the wars, in spite of the plagues, we live longer than we ever have before. This seems to be telling us something. There are 3 more of these rungs to the ladder, making a ladder of 10 rungs, which now becomes more or less the full expectancy of human life, or the possibility of it under normal conditions. But in these 3 new planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, lie the principles and processes of a kind of immortality, a growth beyond the ordinary growth of things. Then the individual who is able, therefore, to develop the inner resources of consciousness without dying in the process. It is now possible to develop the extrasensory perception bands. It is possible for intuition to come into play, for higher consciousness purposes to be understood, and perhaps most of all, a moral sense of responsibility for the consequences of action. In these newly discovered planets, therefore, we have something that breaks the cycle. We have something that goes on beyond, something which may, in the course of time, also make a major change in the life expectancy of all human beings and the life expectancies of nations. But at least there are now things by which we begin to say, after we get to a certain point in the material concerns, we must now turn to the internal. We have explored the 7 continents. We have civilized or destroyed the civilizations of most of them. We have imprisoned and captured practically all the resources of nature. We are on the edge of a world of exhausted resources, a world of exhausted morals, and a world of exhausted finances. We are on the very edge of something that has to change. And this change seems to be implied by these 3 planets, which were unknown to the ancients. And these 3 planets become, perhaps, we hope at least, the symbols of a life beyond the purposes of our present life pattern. We were born to grow up. We grew up to grow older. We raised families. We did the work of the world. We retired our Social Security and Medicare. And that was it. But now there's something else coming in. There's something that's beginning to tell us that this is only the end of a level. This is not the end of our evolution. It is not the termination of growth, or necessarily the immediate disappearance that we might depart from this earth. We are now having many people in their 80s. We are having some people, quite a few, in their 90s. And we have more and more of the other value of these 3, namely insight, inside understanding. The individual who grew up on the outside until he could retire with a fair chance of maintaining himself must now grow up on the inside, because regardless of what happens here, this world is not his home. It is only a place where he is spending a little time, in some cases as a servant, in some cases on a vacation. But in any event, this isn't the end of it, nor is this the end of the need to grow. We are reaching the point where growth is no longer physically useful. We are now using sciences badly because we do not know how to use them, and most of the ones we are discovering now we would be best without. We are therefore going into a dead end. We are trying to keep ourselves busy by artificial means. We are trying to forget our own ignorance by claiming a few discoveries which we will use to kill each other. But now there is gradually coming about the realization that a divine plan is also working here, and that gradually all of these experiences through which we are passing are building towards a better world than we have ever known. We are beginning to realize that in one of two ways we've grown up, either through dedicated effort or through a series of mistaken problems that have disappointed and disillusioned and hurt us. Out of disillusionment comes a new search for reality. Out of the battle of cults comes a new search for religious truths. Out of an unsettled financial condition comes a desire for simple living without worry or contention. And out of political chaos must come a simple method of self-government by which the individual does not need to be constantly corrected for his misdeeds. So little by little, the new world is coming. And with it is coming these three orbits of giving us a potential of 30 years beyond what the ancients understood. We have a longer time to do the things that need doing. Perhaps it's because the things that we need to do have been neglected so very long. Or perhaps we need to do things we didn't know we needed to do in the past. We thought we were doing what was necessary. But now comes the realization that we all have a job right here, reasonably intensive, and that as long as we are able to think, there's something to be thinking about. As long as we realize there is a need, we can contribute in some way to the fulfillment of that need. Everywhere there is new opportunity to grow and new opportunities to serve. We have greater privileges to help to bring about the golden age we look for. So that the new perspective is that the life of the person, first of all, is eternal. The ancients knew this, but we some way got out of it. We mistook the fact that we saw physical terminations and assumed, therefore, that all physical symbols are literal. They must represent exactly what we see. The truth of the matter is that the ancients never believed that. There are very few ancient people who were ever really materialistic, because they had not come to that point in which they became so delighted with their own stupid works that they didn't think there could be anything in space as good as what they have. That the individual was here, was blessed beyond all words, and there was nothing afterwards except the tomb with a few little handfuls of his private property thrown in for luck. Actually, the whole world is changing. The boundaries of life are changing. The more we think of immortality, the longer we will live. The more we live according to the laws of integrity, the better our health will be over long, expanded periods of time. When we keep the emotional virtues of life, there will be more happiness for everyone. And when we raise children properly, we will have children we will love and enjoy as long as they live. All of these things bring about a new world. Thoughtfulness, kindness, generosity, patience, understanding, insight. All these, if they are developed early in life, or as early as we find them, they all contribute to this tomorrow which we are now longing for. We are beginning to realize as never before that things have to change, that there has to be a better way of doing things than we are doing, that we'll never bring about peace by one war after another. We should have known that. The Medes and the Persians knew it 5,000 years ago, but we were slow of learning. One thing, we immediately discarded the wisdom of the ancients because it conflicted with the ignorance of today. We didn't want to know what they thought, because if we really accepted their thoughts and their codes, we'd have to live better. And it was better to forget them than change our own habits. So we have ignored all of these ideals that could have been a great help to us. It might have saved several great wars. But now comes the realization, as never before, that there is such a thing as peace. There is such a thing as human beings becoming constructive individuals in a world plan for ordered existence. There is a possibility, therefore, to liberate the individual from the tyranny of the unimportant, to give the person an opportunity to grow. Moore, in his Utopia, makes this point very clearly. People not burdened by the misdeeds of themselves and each other, or not striving after goals which are worthless and bring only misery, people who live quietly have time to think. They have time to read good books. They have time to be with their children. They have time to serve social purposes. They will help to maintain the integrities of nations rather than be forced out as soldiers to be killed for systems that they do not even believe in. So there's always a new way coming. And in the discovery of new planets, we find a series of factors. Uranus, for instance, shows us the use of machines. It begins to tell us the possibilities of the proper use of labor-saving devices. The morality, however, has not been developed. You cannot make a successful machine unless you are dedicated to the use of it for constructive purposes. Machines cannot make better people. Machines can only enslave people. But machines used by intelligent people can advance the state of civilization. They can end once and for all the tyranny that must arise when a world as complex as ours is left to its own devices. We don't have to have wars. We don't have to build nuclear weapons. But we do have to have integrities in ourselves, not to destroy machines, but to see that they are used for the common good. But invention is part of the Uranian change that has come to us since the days of the ancients. The next thing that has been noticeable to us, perhaps, is Neptune. And Neptune is a very mysterious and strange planet. But it has some very interesting bywords or terms which are associated with it. Neptune is a planet devoted to the search for the innermost. Neptune is the one planet that helps us to understand the causes and effects with which we are affected. Neptune can show why we suffer, and by so doing indicate how to cease to suffer. Neptune represents a universe of invisible principles which must be obeyed. It brings us closer and closer to the divine plan of things. It increases the extrasensory perception band. It results in all kinds of researches into the great immortalities of existence. Neptune also has to do with the development of certain extra faculty perceptions of the mind, by means of which we become aware and become capable of estimating, interpreting, and using laws of nature which we never knew before. Neptune will contribute to us a tremendous, intensive examination of nature, so that we can learn for once and for all the reasons for the wonders that we see. Neptune can help us to trace every one of the wonders of life to its divine origin. It can help us to live according to these wonders, according to these rules and these principles which are so important to our ultimate destiny. And then we come finally to the rulership of Pluto. Pluto is a member of our family that has just more or less appeared out of the researchers at Flagstaff. But Pluto was an ancient god of the underworld and was also the Roman god of wealth. Well, the world of wealth is the underworld. The world of wealth is this world in which all good things are sacrificed and everything that is done ends in punishment. But Pluto also has a different meaning. Pluto has to do with the foregoing conclusion, what is to take the place of wealth? What are we going to do instead of trying to make money? What are we going to do to prevent money from ruling the men who rule us? How are we going to prevent money from being the cause of war, or the cause of injustice? How are we going to prevent bringing up generations of children to believe that money is the only thing that's important, and thus ending in endless crime? I think that the answer probably was pretty much the way it was a couple of hundred years ago when they first began to study it but didn't know much about the planet. And that is that in some way Pluto is the planet of retribution. It is the payment for the mistakes. It isn't a destroyer. It's just something that quietly, forcibly, inevitably points out that we're doing it wrong. Now, a lot of people hope that they can do it wrong and be happy. But this has not been one of the common experiences we have known. The individual who makes the mistakes is finally unhappy, but of course always has a quick answer that there's someone else to blame for his unhappiness. The actual answer to the whole thing lies in the fact that everything has consequences. And in order to use Pluto, which is wealth, properly, we must find out what wealth is. Actually, wealth is nothing more or less than maturity protecting life. The individual who is truly mature is not in danger. The individual who understands the ways of human life correctly is not going to be an accumulator of wealth, but he is going to have an accumulation of values which can be shared equally with all peoples. Wealth has got to be understood, and wealth has got to be appreciated as a medium of exchange and not as a source of success. We have to realize that wealth is something we must outgrow before we lose what is left of our divine inheritance. Actually, the great change that is coming is to be brought about largely by Uranus, Pluto, and Neptune. These are the planets of the new age. These are the ways by means of which we can adjust to the future. And they also remind us very certainly and very definitely that there is no such a thing as a punishment for the sake of punishment. There is no such a thing as an ultimate fatality of things. We are all making little mistakes, but also making a great deal of progress by contemplating the results of our own mistakes. The only way we can ever hope to outgrow our troubles is to realize that we have caused them and face into the simple fact that we alone can change them. We're waiting for something to come down from heaven or for some wise person to administer the affairs of mankind. The wise person who will manage our affairs is locked within each of us. We are the makers of our own miseries, and we are the makers of our own regeneration from miseries. We are the source of the solution as well as the source of the ailment. And we are gradually coming to it right now, and within the next few years there is obvious evidence that we are going to begin the great problem of taking the experiences of the past and interpreting them in terms of the needs of the future. We are not going to bury the ancients and say they were poor, benighted characters who believed in good conduct. We're going to realize that they were the right ones. And we're going to find that in the wisdom of the ages we have plenty of material to assist us in creating a better world. And as we create better worlds, we have better people. And they in turn create still better worlds. When things start moving in the right direction, the momentum can increase. But the momentum must always begin with a little child opening its eyes upon a strange world and depending entirely upon the love of mother and father to survive. And if that is betrayed, that child will become part of the great liability. But if these young people are brought up with understanding and insight, and if the older generation realizes its own limitations and seeks to push forward into the future those young people who must be the hope of the future, and will spend more time building better futures for their children and grandchildren than trying to be more comfortable in themselves and ignore their responsibilities to society. It's all going to work out, and it's going to be good for everybody when it's finished. But in the meantime, wherever we are in the cycle of age, from the beginning to the end, we have to work to understand and correct the problem that is focused upon us by our own place and our own life cycle. At certain ages, we have to face certain problems. If we face each problem as it arises, the next problem is comparatively easy. But if we neglect the first, we'll have trouble all the way through to the end. We've got to find better ways of starting young people out in life. We've got to find better parents. We've got to get over the idea of leaving the child on the doorstep. We've got to get out of the idea that we have to blow the child up in order to conquer the country that it belongs to. All these things are the great perversities of life. And as long as the human being, either the dictator or the private family tyrant, will continue to hurt for personal gratification, there is no answer. But if you hurt long enough, you hurt yourself. And then final time of things, the abused turn. The abused stomach turns on us. The abused body rebels against us. The abused society turns against its masters. But it's all part of a wonderful story. And every story that exists in nature and is supported by nature and is fulfilled through nature is a success story. It shows that no matter how stupid we are or how long we stay that way, nature is going to outwit us. And in the long run, we're going to become wonderful, intelligent, and useful citizens in the universal empire. With this thought in mind, we can face the day maybe with a little better hope. Rebirth into the natural universe toward which we are all moving. In the old days, the Sabians and Chaldeans and Babylonian seers, and it's interesting that in the latest revision of the Bible, the three wise men who came to the cradle of Jesus are restored to their original meaning. So the printed version now says the three astronomers, or astrologers. They were the Babylonians coming in search of the fulfillment of a natural law. So with this point in view, we're reminded that in the ancient times, the different ones of these 7 orbits, or 7 forces, were given different year allotments. Some had many years given to them and some a few. But with the addition of 3 planets to the solar system in more recent times, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, we now have 10 instead of 7 elements with which to work. To meet this command or change, it has been normally accepted to allow each of the 10 to represent 10 years of natural life. Therefore, the 10 planets, or the 8 planets and the 2 luminaries, cover a period of life of 100 years. Each one having 10 years, each one assigned to a 10-year period. And through these sets of 10-year periods, all living things pass. Kingdoms pass into democracies and into chaos. Governments go from strictness to anarchy. Human beings pass from childhood to old age. Health passes from good to bad. Virtues rise and fall. Empires come and go. Wars and peace alternate. In all things, this septenary, or now brought up to a decade of 10, represent 10 periods of 10 years each. And therefore, what we're going to do now is to determine, if we can, the rules of these 10-year periods as they relate to the civilization we live in now, not as the ancient times, and also relate to the 10 inevitable divisions of human life. We not only have what the ancients referred to as the 7 rounds and races, that was part of it in the old days, but now we have the 10 instead of 7, and we were called in those days. Now this has nothing to do with astrology, so called. It has to do with a symbolic picture of the world as it was recorded by Ptolemy of Alexandria. And this system of Ptolemy remained undisputed until the rise of Copernicus and Galileo. And according to the Rosicrucians of the 17th century, modern astronomy does not conflict with the ancient system, because they apply to two different purposes. And the ancient system is just as true as the modern system, because it relates to psychological and mystical practices and policies which physical astronomy knows nothing about. So with our study of the problem, we come to the conclusion that there was a ladder of 7 problems, 7 things that had to be accomplished, 7 patterns of laws that had to be kept, 7 departments of human conduct that had to be fulfilled if the being was to pass on to the higher realms of insight. So we have this little problem this morning, and in the days of Ptolemy, the 7 luminary planets, or the combination of 5 planets and 2 luminaries, were assigned as rulers of these 7 steps. And these rulerships had nothing to do with fortune-telling, and had nothing to do at all with the idea of the planets in their rulerships over personal destiny. The planets became the symbols of the great problems that had to be faced. And in mysterious ways, these planets were not only designating the fates of persons, they were also showing the pattern by which everything must live if it is to survive. Nature's laws were embodied in this septenary, and no one could break the rules without suffering. We are beginning now, in the last 5 years perhaps especially, to be aware of the danger of breaking rules. For some time we have lived very badly. For a long time we have abused nature. We have continued to break the normal patterns of human life, and in Well, we had a little delay this morning on account of the videotape, but I understand it's solved. We have a very interesting problem today. Sir Wallis Budge of the British Museum's Department of Egyptology and Babylonia pointed out that probably the most ancient civilization recorded on the western side of evolution was in the valley of the Euphrates. Babylonia and Phoenicia and Saba, from which we have later created the word Sheba. These civilizations were scientifically established not less than 5000 BC. Many believe much longer. And it was from this area that sciences in the Western world had their beginnings. On the plains of Babylonia, there were great observatories that were in ruins long before the beginning of Greek civilization. These towers were observatories, and they were also mysterious analogical symbols of beliefs that were held at that time. According to the Babylonians, the universe was a kind of mountain, and this mountain rose in 7 ridges, or in 7 levels, and finally at the top was an altar for the eternal God. Each of the levels of the towers, called ziggurats, was of a different color, and various pigments were used in the making of brick or of painting the surfaces afterwards. These colors represented those assigned to the 7 planets known to the ancients. More correctly, 5 planets and 2 luminaries. These planet-luminary combinations represented a ladder, its lower rung upon the surface of the earth,
and its higher rung reaching up to the jewel of 7 stars, the mystery of the Dipper. So doing, have brought down upon ourselves one calamity after another. It is not that these calamities arise out of some mysterious evil spirit in the sky. They arise from the natural breaking of natural law. They arise from the fact that the individual does not keep the rules by which the universe was created, by which it must be maintained, and by which it will ultimately achieve perfection and pass on to still higher levels of life and patterned purpose. So in this particular case, we know that the planets represented problems. This doesn't mean that the planets bestowed these problems. They merely became symbols of them. The problems themselves are part of a great septenary of immutable principles and processes going on in life. The ancients understood this by a series of astronomical allegories, symbols, creating what is known as the geocentric system, a universe with the Earth in the center and not the Sun. Now, the reason why the Earth is in the center of this pattern is because this is where we are. And this pattern is prepared for us. It isn't prepared for creatures living on the Sun or in the galaxy. It is prepared for individuals who come into this world, into this Earth, into this natural environment. And they are the ones that have to obey these rules. And for these people, in this pattern, the ascending order of the planets and luminaries was different from that of today. It is not parallel with our modern concept of the solar system. In those ancient times, the planets ascending from the surface of the Earth began with the moon. The moon was the first. The second was Mercury. The third was Venus. The fourth was the Sun. The fifth was Mars. The sixth was Jupiter. And the seventh was Saturn. And those were the septenaries, those were the great deities of the Olympian throne, and also show in Oriental philosophy. Now these 7 constituted the ladder, about up which the human being, the nation, the world, governments, religions, everything have to ascend in the process of birth and rebirth. Birth into this world and Actually, life to these people was a series of systematic ascents, and this system of ascending values applied to everything. It applied to the life of plants and flowers. It applied to the life of mankind, to nations, and to the planet itself. Every form of life was advancing systematically through 7 steps, and these steps had to be fulfilled if the final purpose of evolution was to be attained. These beliefs were very strongly transferred to Egypt and later to Greece and Rome. And the wise men of Babylonia came to be called Chaldeans, a term that did not necessarily mean that they came from the area known as Chaldea, which was part of Babylonia, but because of their knowledge, their wisdom. The Chaldeans were the sages that governed the states, regulated the empires, and informed and instructed the rulers. All of this was part of a very interesting program, a program which had to do with the 7 steps that all living things must make between their entry into this world and their departure therefrom. And regardless of the passing of time, of ages, of civilizations, and the rise and fall of customs and governments, these 7 steps came into prominence and were assigned to every living thing. All things that entered this world with the first step left with the 7th. And between the 2 were all the others in their proper sequences. Now, each of these steps was not only a symbolic pattern, but it was a responsibility. These 7 steps constituted the way in which all living things mature according to natural law.
and any break or variation in this pattern was disastrous to those who broke the law. These 7 steps were the things that human beings and nations likewise had to understand and had to abide by the rules of the 7 stars as they